Thank you so very much for coming on a snowy night. I know oftentimes it's easy to stay at home when it's snowy and the roads are not so great. So I appreciate each and every one of you coming and sitting here with us and Jud. Yeah. So welcome to Galvanize, and we are live streaming tonight, so welcome to everybody that's tuning in live streaming. Galvanize is a co-working and boot camp, so we're the learning community for technology. If this is your first time in this building, please find me or one of our staff members after, and we can talk to you a little bit more about what we do and who we are. But essentially, we're a place to work and a place to learn. And we teach coders how to code and data scientists how to crunch some data. So tonight we're here with Jud. Thank you so very much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me, Katie.
Yeah, no problem. And Jud is really an institution in Boulder and the Boulder tech scene, and we will get into all of that. But first, let's give a big round of applause and a big warm welcome on this cold night to Jud for being here.
Thanks for coming out, for sure. Yeah, pretty chilly.
Yeah, exactly. And there are some special guests in the audience. We've got some Founder Hour alum. We've got some family members. So thanks for coming and supporting. So I want to start with I want to start with your background, like way back in the beginning, and what originally drew you to tech, because you have a degree in computer science, and how that all started.
Let's see. I grew up in Boulder. My parents are actually here. And was first kind of exposed to tech in Boulder, which actually was all old hardware stuff. It was all storage related, not a ton of software. And then my dad's back there telling me to talk more louder. So kind of first some peripheral exposure in that realm, in the hardware realm, but grew up here, went to school here, ultimately up through University of Colorado Boulder. And along the way, I thought I was going to do art-related stuff, actually, and started pursuing that at CU. And then realized I was spending all my spare time writing software, and just kind of had that moment where I was like, well, should I go pursue what I clearly want to be doing instead of what felt like work, and tipped over into software that way and went through the program at CU. Had a great time there, great school, all that went well, and interned along the way with IBM in Boulder, actually, just off 63rd. Yeah, so that kind of got me started on the software path.
I love it. And we're going to talk a lot about the company that you founded, Gnip, and we'll talk a little bit about Honey, which is where you are now. But before that, you graduate from CU. You're interested in computer science. What do you do, and you intern at IBM. What do you do between that time and Gnip?
A lot of things. At that time, late 90s, Boulder didn't really have a lot of software going on. No offense to folks in the room if you were writing software back then. There was software here, but it was quite different. The whole software environment was different. The industry was completely different, and the industry really was in Silicon Valley at the time. So graduated CU Boulder, went to work for Netscape Communications out there, and actually current Boulderite, old Netscape colleague is actually in the back as well. We could talk about his story forever.
Jud stacked the audience tonight, everybody.
Exactly, yeah.
Just get ready.
Yeah, 2/3 of you I know very well. Anyway, went out there to do software there, because those types of opportunities just didn't exist here. Lots of hardware storage related technology, but not consumer facing type software. So was out there for a few years, moved back here in 1999, actually stayed with that entity. AOL bought Netscape, and I stayed there for quite a while. Along the way, Boulder's software scene started to pick up and evolve. Some interesting things happened. Google bought a company called At Last here for a meaningful, at the time, amount of money, which is $67 million, and in the community here, that was a big deal. One, the dollar amount was a big deal. Two, the buyer was a big deal. That's a legitimate software company. And it was particularly legitimate at that point in time. So that kind of validated some of the construction that was being done here, the software construction that was being done here. And around that time also, we had some Valley financier veterans move in the Foundry Group crew. They knew how to raise capital around software and then vend the capital out and make software-related investments within a couple of years of that happening. And that flywheel started to catch in the community, and I left my telecommuting situation and joined a local startup here. It was actually a very pivotal startup. It flamed out in an incredibly disastrous way, but it was a company called Medium. Grew rapidly and had an interesting winding path, but a lot of folks interested in building software and starting companies came out of that thing. It was actually, I don't know how many people are aware of that. Who knew about Medium prior to me just saying it? Just a few, yeah. It's actually a pivotal company in our history here. A lot of people spun out of that and went on to build great companies.
I actually, fun fact, was a product tester for Medium. I was about 18 and I was nannying for the CFO at the time. So that's Boulder, everybody. So it's neat to hear that you had a piece in that, because I know a number of people that came out of that company, which eventually became One Riot, and then we worked with Gnip, which, it all like ties together, like hashtag Boulder, right?
Exactly. And so that walked that path for a while, left Medium, and then was just kind of floating around a little bit. And one of the Foundry guys, Brad Feld, and I had a relationship, and he had a relationship with another entrepreneur, and was trying to connect dots and did so between us, the three of us. And he's kind of the third co-founder of that company, but I don't know if he can say that because it's just as an investor. But anyway, the three of us kind of got together and came up with the idea and an approach, and Foundry provided seed capital, $1 million to get that going, and off to the races.
So what experiences did you take from Medium, from IBM, working out at Netscape, that you brought to Gnip, kind of like the do's and don'ts of working at a company? Did you take any of those along with you?
Yes, absolutely. Countless lessons from all of them, right? Yeah. At the time, at least, lessons from IBM, you can have all the money in the world and move too slowly to really do anything impactful on the consumer software side of things. Medium, growing too fast, can tear everything apart. Learn that lesson for sure. Also a lot on leadership at Medium, do's and don'ts. And then on the Netscape side of things, that experience codified my perspective on software and how to build sustainable software and sustainable software teams. That was kind of the eye opener for me in terms of how to approach construction.
Yeah. So here we are at this junction in your life where you're with Brad, you're looking for the next thing to do, and you have Gnip. How did the idea of Gnip? Well, first of all, let's start out with what was Gnip's original iteration? How did Gnip start?
Yeah, good question.
Yanni?
Yeah. Speaking of old Medium. The first thing to say there is you have to keep in mind that was 10, 12-ish years ago. Social was not then what it is today. It was unclear what social was going to be. That was the era of MySpace. MySpace had around then just collapsed. Facebook was trying to find its way. Twitter had started, but these were concepts. They weren't fabric in society. But the insight we had was anytime you pull together a statistically significant group of people and they are talking publicly, commercial interest follows. And what we had resolved was we were going to try to connect those two dots, the commercial interest in public conversation and the publishers of that information in the form of social networks, essentially. And we thought we could be relevant because at the time, social networks were utterly clueless around what data meant. They were trying to keep their systems running, let alone understanding how to commercialize access to that data, and let alone how to build externally facing APIs that scale appropriately to external demand. And so we were going to sit in the middle, and did sit in the middle, and mitigate that from a business context and a technical context. So we just built infrastructure that connected those two interests.
So you're creating this like confluence of data streams that somebody can pull off of. So instead of attaching to each API, they have one place where they can go, connect in, and pull that data. And this is revolutionary. Like, this is the first time that this is happening, back in 2008.
Well, certainly with social data. I mean, the notion of APIs and data streaming is old as dirt. But in the social context, yeah, it had not been terribly considered. And so our thought was, well, let's consider this. Let's try to build some formality around this and build an ecosystem around this and an industry around this.
Yeah. In the early days, what are some of those challenges that you hit coming up with a concept that a lot of like blog publishers, they're not used to seeing that yet, and social definitely isn't there. How are you selling the idea? How are you creating that platform for something that's so new?
Yeah, good question. A lot of conversations with the publishers. They had varying understanding of the demand that was out there. Most of them had bad experiences in the form of commercial or potentially malicious interest hammering their infrastructure and then knocking it over, and it was just a problem for them. So, illustrating how we had a solution to that problem and then potentially how you could actually capitalize on that was part of what we were doing on that end. And then the demand side, we read that really well. The market, as is painfully obvious today, for conversational data is insatiable, and we read that just fine. And so that the sales side on that end, we certainly had battles to fight, and it took a while to generate revenue. But the sales side on that ultimately wound up kind of selling itself, but it took a while to ramp that up. And because this topic is pretty sensitive today, a little more background on what we were doing. So and this can get political really quickly. We can go there if you want, but to try to steer it away from there. To be clear, we only ever participated in publicly accessible data. Never any direct messages, never any private messages. And then we can launch into the conversation of what public actually means. Happy to do that, but I just want to, at a minimum, clarify, we never touched or saw any private information, what I'd consider private information. Which is
we'll get into that at some point tonight, I'm sure. So I'm going to step into this founder position for a second here. Your co-founder, Eric Marcoulier, you guys connected via Brad Feld. One of the questions that comes up a lot with founders in the space is if you're a technical founder and you have a non-technical founder, where do you decide, where do you have that conversation of who's going to be the CEO, who's going to be the CTO, and how do you kind of draw those boundaries and have that it's a tough conversation to have as co-founders, who's going to run what and who's experienced in what. When did you have that conversation, and what did that look like?
Yeah, it actually was not a hard conversation for us. It can obviously be one, but for us it was not, just because the roles were so obvious and clear. Eric was a charismatic, externally facing social person. I was, introvert with technical background, so it's just obvious. When that's not so obvious, it absolutely gets hairy. And you've probably heard this before in certain contexts, but it is funny how we get wrapped up in titles, because the reality of the situation is, in a startup, it couldn't be any more meaningless. There are roles people play. There are leaders, and there are people that are not leaders, and the titles are just, it couldn't mean less. So on the advice front, getting wrapped around that axle early on, operationally and mechanically, just doesn't mean anything. You may have ego wrapped up in that for you personally, like I have to be CEO, or I have to be this, and that's fine. That's your but be clear and aware that's your ego, not something that's going to materially matter.
I think there's this saying, it was on a sticker that I have, that says, when you're in a startup, it feels like you're on fire and you're riding a bike and it's on fire and everything's on fire and things are on fire, but you're just like moving. And that's when you can't get caught up in titles, because you're just trying to keep the fire at bay and you're just going.
I think there's more, I think that might be softening a bit now, because this concept of startup is a little more understood and known. And early on, it wasn't as much. So I think people maybe needed title to represent something, whereas I think now more and more people generally understand that a startup is just this chaotic thing in motion, and that the titles aren't as relevant. But
so as you're starting this company, 2008, the tech scene in Boulder is starting to take off. We've got some pivotal companies that are here being formed. Did you guys see Gnip playing such a huge part in what would become the Boulder ultimate, what we know as today as the Boulder tech scene? Did you guys go in with that plan, or were you just like, we're going to do our best and hope it works out?
Just the latter. We all, for a long time, we were just trying to stay alive, and importantly, I think you just said something that is notable, and that is the goal has to be about just getting things done and just executing. I think we did a lot of things right on that front. The goal was to build a big, sustainable business. That was it. Very hard to do that, but that's all we were ever trying to do. We were not trying to go public. We were not trying to get bought. We were not trying to do something in a year. We were not trying to do another thing in 10 years. None of that. We just were doing that. And when you set kind of an ambiguous goal like that, when it's oriented properly, you're perpetually trying to do that, and you're building optionality, and hopefully opportunities come up along the way. But I don't subscribe to the philosophy of set a target like this revenue or that IPO or that acquisition. I just think you limit. These things are all so statistically not going to happen that to further narrow your thinking, it just sets you off other orders of magnitude away from getting anything done.
So as you're building this, were there moments where you pivoted what you did? Your hypothesis was this, reaching out with publishers, making this, data stream converse, like the social signals are going to be there at some point, making that happen, and then your goal is build a sustainable business. Did you ever pivot through that process? As you grew, what did that look like as social came up, as data started to change and really, really, truly gain momentum? Did you guys ever pivot as a business, or pivot what you were thinking or hoping, or your goals? What did that look like?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the product changed several times along the way, and in some instances significantly. we had to flip the whole business model upside down. We thought the publishers would pay, and in the end, there was a non-trivial financial dynamic there, but for the first 2/3 of our existence, there wasn't. And the first year of our life, we thought we would be generating revenue from the publisher end, and we never generated a dollar. And I fully credit Eric for that pivot. You know, he set a timer, and it was 12 months, and if we weren't generating revenue after 12 months, we were going to pivot the product, and we did. And so we inverted that, and we pursued revenue generation on the consumption side, not the production side. And we had and then we pivoted on that several times. Like, took a while to get even that right, but we thought the people that were going to be writing checks at the beginning, we thought that was going to be the target. It turned out to be literally the opposite.
The consumer of it.
Yeah, the consumer of the content, yeah.
What are some of the use cases that were coming out of that? In my research I did a lot of research on you. You're on the internet, newsflash. One of the things that I read about was emergency services pulling useful information from social signals using that Twitter or that Gnip fire hose. What other use cases were coming out of that consumption side of how people were using your product?
Yeah, I always think the disaster services emergency response thing is always an interesting one, and it did not wind up being as big as I thought it was going to be, but people were starting to communicate kind of everything publicly over social, and including things like, my apartment building is burning down. And in emergency response, it's an emergency, and you want to respond. And that industry clued into this fact that they were often getting that notification, or that a person in an emergency situation was often announcing that through this new medium that industry had never even seen before. So that was a pretty interesting use case, I thought. Not necessarily as voluminous in terms of customer count, but on that front, marketing is the easy and obvious one. You know, someone releases a new iPhone into the market, and wants to understand what unabated, unbiased consumer response is. Well, people talk, right? I love this thing, I hate this thing. Marketers, that was what we thought the nugget would be, and it turned out to be the nugget. Sure. No surprise. But that was another obvious use case, was the marketing end of it. Yeah. People getting an interestingly sized sample of a population that they'd never had access to before.
As we're talking, you sound very astute in all of your observations, right? Like, you're not just building this startup that's like on a whim and then you switch and then it's fine and then it's, you guys seem very calculated, and maybe luck wasn't so much to play in the success of Gnip, but maybe the thought process and the strategic, processing of what's going on. Do you feel like luck had anything to do with it, or was it more preparation, or is it a combination of both?
Just that always gets distilled down to the adage, luck favors the prepared. Sure. It's always a combination, in my opinion. I chuckle a little bit thinking you saying I sound astute on the topic. I've had years to digest the thing. Sure. Now. In the moment it's a shitstorm, and you can't see what's happening around you. It was far from. I think we had some good North Stars we were following, and some good paths we were following, but the walk down the path was anything but calculated. Yeah.
How did data progress over Gnip's 6-year existence? It started out, bloggers was one thing, you're thinking that, and then social just has this huge boom. It kind of takes over life, right? Twitter, Facebook, it's just there. How did data and how much was actually coming through, how did that change, and then how did that change how you guys did business?
In a word, volume changed. When we first started, the measure for me is when we first started working with the Twitter fire hose, peaks were in the 8 tweets per second range. That would be a high volume event on the system, and everyone was kind of shocked, you know. And there are some more recent Twitter people in here than me that would have better numbers here, but I have to assume at this point 100,000 public messages per second is maybe not, you know, constant, but just happens, you know, and the spikes have got to be much greater than that. So think about the scale of those numbers, right? Turn the 8 to 10, and then, you know, consider the 100,000 figure, several orders of magnitude. And from an infrastructure and a software standpoint, those are completely different systems. And that's what we did well. We built infrastructure to filter and maintain those resulting streams in real time better than anyone else was doing. And that became our thing, was reliable tuning of those streams so you could consume just the content you were after.
Yeah. As the technical leader of the team, how are you problem solving that big of a shift, you know, over your existence of your company? How are you implementing new systems and hiring the right people? And, you know, as that technical leader, what does that look like?
For me, I'm far from the smartest software person. For me, that was understanding the magnitude of the problem we were trying to solve and trying to engage people's minds who wanted to feast on that and had 10 times the capability that I had. So that's how I approached that, was just get the right smart people in the room, because I knew I had a problem that I believed I had a problem that smart people would be drawn to, and so it was about getting that in front of them.
I'm going to touch on the ethical side of things. Like, we're just going to go there. It's like we're just diving right in. Because we talked before this, we always talk to everybody before we sit down and interview them so they know what questions are coming. When we talked earlier, we chatted very briefly about the kind of data you were using and the kind of encounters that you were having, how other people were using data. Where did you personally, as the technical founder, where did you draw that line and say, we're not going to cross that line? It's very tempting to cross that line, but we're just not going to do it. Where did you draw that line, and then what is public data that you were using, what does that mean? Like, how were you defining that?
I was able to define that very simply at the time because it was actually my Netscape experience that codified the URL in my mind, and what the URL meant. And so it was very clear to me there are URLs that are publicly accessible, and they are not, and there are URLs that are not. And my views on this have changed a bit over the years, but at the time, certainly, I believed we all had to know that when you published something, it was simply public. And I thought you were an idiot if you didn't know that. And so for me, the technical line was very simple. If the URL was publicly accessible, then I would then, and I'd probably somewhat make this argument still today, then it's fair game. You have shouted from the mountaintop, and therefore anyone that wants to sit around the bottom of the mountain and listen can consume the information. If a URL, so that's on the publishing side. So you as a user, if you put something out there, if you shout from the mountaintop, it's fair game, it's public. It's akin to me for you going into the public square and talking, or talking in public. Now there's a technical nuance in there, which the name of this changes depending on who you're talking to, but I always call them blind URLs, and those are URLs that technically have no auth in front of them, but they're obfuscated, or they're incalculable, or they're just goop. Flickr actually kind of launched those for the first time en masse for consumers. Is brilliant. And those, we didn't want to touch those either because the expectation with the end user in that situation is very clear, which was the intent of a blind URL is that the conversation actually is not public. That was very clear to me. Someone might get pedantic and say, well, it's technically still public, so you should have used it, but we didn't. There wasn't a lot of that, but we didn't do that. There wasn't a lot of that out in the industry, but we statedly would not do that. So that there was an instance where there was I would argue, a clear expectation of privacy. So although technically the URL was public, we didn't play with that. And then obviously anything that required authentication was not something we wanted to get into. Where you come out on that ethically aside, the technical challenges there were you just wouldn't want to go there anyway, and we just didn't, from an ethics standpoint, we didn't want to touch it anyway because we'd be violating that perspective. We were trying to build a business on public conversation. There are plenty of people out there trying to build businesses on private conversation. You can argue the value difference between those is higher or lower. It's, kind of remains to be seen. And we ran into those folks out in the industry that were trying to build businesses on very clearly private data, or very clearly data that the end user did not ever have any intent on being made public. Because we were building an industry, frankly, and there were other people already there doing different things, and we were all trying to figure out who's our partner, who's our enemy, who's our competitor. So you wind up in those conversations, and the ones you don't like, you walk away from.
Yeah. And having the wherewithal and the understanding of yourself as a company to do that is huge, because a lot of people that we've seen recently, don't necessarily have that, line that they draw in the sand.
Yeah, that was just kind of obvious to us from a scale standpoint. Even forget all the ethics, if you just wanted to have a conversation about total addressable market and profit, I would rapidly argue that building a public industry results in a much greater financial outcome rather than playing in some black market. Sure. Right? You can make a quick buck, it may be a big buck, but it's just not sustainable. And having an antagonistic relationship with the publishers, with the end users, it's just who has energy for that, right? And not anything any of us wanted to get involved with for 10 reasons.
So we're going to take a little leap forward into the exit piece. So when did you start having conversations with Twitter? How did that relationship go? Because ultimately, for those of you, spoiler alert, Gnip got acquired by Twitter. When did you start having that conversation? What did that look like? Was there a relationship beforehand? You hadn't planned for an exit when you started the company, but it maybe developed along the way.
Yeah, this is where the value of good, experienced investors in your field really kicks in. We took early advice from our investors there on, partnering, and if you want to have a deeper relationship with an entity downstream, partner early. Don't jump in with the end game conversation. Figure out how to partner together, because that's what an acquisition is anyway. It's just some level of a partnership, I would argue. So you have to get the foundation in place first, and a partnership is easy is the wrong word, a more defined framework for getting to learn about each other. And so we pursued partnerships with lots of different publishers, Twitter obviously being one of them, and a notable one, and worked with them for years. And we were solving something that they were trying to figure out also. We believe we had the better model, and so we were going to go build a business on this, and they were a part of that. And so constant carrying and feeding of a partnership relationship for years. And then, if all those pistons are firing and all of that's working, everybody's winning, needs are getting met, money's moving around in the right places at the right times, and you've got the fruition there of, okay, wow, maybe we should take this outside the partnership arena and into, roll it in, pull it in.
And was that the first time that you'd ever been through an acquisition at such a high level? The first time you saw how the levers moved and the wizard behind the curtain and what those business dealings look like?
Yeah, at that level as a CTO at the time, yes, yeah. I had at AOL I was on the M&A due diligence team, and so doing kind of technical due diligence in the M&A context. I'd had some exposure there, but it's a very small slice. But yeah, the bigger picture thing, that was a first, yeah.
What advice can you give to founders that are moving towards that stage on M&A from that experience that you took away, going through that negotiation and communication process?
It's the same in any negotiation context. It's know your place, know what you have, know what your value is, stand strong, but know where your breaking points are, know what your deal breakers are. Typical negotiation perspective, sure. There's just so much that goes into it. If you love what you have and what you're doing and price is not a thing and you could do that forever, then you kind of get to pick your price. You may not consummate a deal, but you may not sell or move for the number that you ultimately want, but you're happy not being acquired. Best understanding of all of those levers that you can possibly have in the moment is important. I don't have a nugget there.
No, I mean, that decent enough nugget to know your value, right? Like, don't just give in to give in unless you're really ready.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, don't just bounce to bounce.
Yeah.
Bye.
Maybe one thing I would say there that I apply all over my life is kind of the 5 to 10% rule. Kind of in anything from my perspective. If you're so close to accomplishing something, whether that's negotiating with a car salesman over the car you want, or the house you want, or the rent you want, or just whatever the deal is, if you're close enough, fighting for and or chipping away at a remaining 5% is pretty silly most of the time. And I would argue that kind of regardless of the order of magnitude of scale of money, if we're negotiating the cost of a pizza, for us to go crazy over $1, it's kind of weird. If you're selling your company for $1 billion, is 50 million a lot? Heck yes, but context matters and perspective matters. And to kill a deal over that, I think it'd be pretty silly.
Oftentimes companies are acquired for talent or the product. What interest did words are hard. What interest did Gnip have or Twitter have in Gnip? Was it just the product? Was it the engineering team? Was it the whole thing? And what ultimately what piece of it did they acquire? Was it all of it?
All right, this is when the conversation gets tricky because I just start coming off arrogant. We nailed all those things.
Love it.
That was intentional. The arc of the company, we were building this thing, this sustainable entity, soup to nuts. We knew we never wanted to be, it's more kind of what we did not want to be than what we wanted to be, I guess. We knew we did not want to be an acqui-hire situation. We were not building that. We were also building a business. Conversely, we knew we did not want to sell somebody a spreadsheet. We had built real intellectual property and something that was very hard to build, and we were building value there, and so you were buying that also. And that has stood the test of time. That office, there's a Twitter office in Boulder now. It's the old Gnip team they've not only continued investing in that tech team and that tech stack, we're the most, this is public information, we're the most profitable group in Twitter. It's a huge business now. And, you know, that was, they knew what they were buying. You know, we did not have a lot of leverage, would have loved to have had more, but they knew what they were buying and what they were getting. And, you know, if the other guy was here, he'd say he paid for it, but yeah. Another conversation.
That says something. Deserves a congratulations that you all managed to build that. And that's how you wanted to let it go, was a full-on business. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Piece for sure. You stayed in Boulder afterwards. I mean, obviously you're here, your parents are here, your family's here. What makes Boulder so special, and why do you want to stick around and continue to build things here?
My growing up here, you know, my affinity toward the locale is long and deep, and you know, it's the regular list of stuff, right? It's out your back door access to riding your bike. You know, time in the Bay Area was spent in a car, driving my bike somewhere to go ride on my bike, right? It was just, that's not my existence here, and that's what one of the lifestyle things I love about it here. From an intellectual stimulation standpoint, you know, Boulder's incredible now. You know, I don't know how often people use this anymore, but the kind of the cafe line test. You know, any community you go to, you know, go get coffee and eavesdrop on the conversations. And for a software person, what I want to hear is people talking. I mean, I'm old now, but so sometimes I can get, you know, if I hear someone talking about Malak and Alec and Free, and you know, I'm happy. You know, modernizing that a bit. If we're talking about Go or microservices, and if that's the debate or the, you know, over coffee conversation in that casual setting, to me it's just a representation of the culture and the community that is in that locale. And I just like that stuff. You know, I like being around smart people, constantly learning. And for me, you know, Boulder provides that. And now we have a flourishing ecosystem around software. Like, you know, whatever, 15, 16, 17, 18 years ago, this didn't exist. You know, we had some hardware storage nerds in the room that you could have a conversation with, and, you know, materials people that could talk about storage densities on disks, and it's just not as expansive. Software is a magical thing to me, and you know, we have a flourishing ecosystem around that now.
I want to talk about what you're doing now. So you took some time off between Twitter, and now you're with Honey. Yeah. And Honey, if you listen to Pod Save America at all, they say their catchphrase is "catch great buys with Honey," which I think is so witty and amazing. But it's this digital couponing to help you save money when you're on websites, which is brilliant. How did you get involved with Honey? What are you working on Honey now, and what brought it to Boulder?
I got involved in Honey as an investor. Old Gnip person went and is the chief operating officer there now. I invested in that context, and then that was a while ago, and I realized I wanted to get back into something operational. Coincidentally, Honey wanted to expand beyond downtown Los Angeles, which is where they're headquartered. They have a couple hundred people there. And just true coincidence and timing, I wanted to get back into building software and put our heads together. And the thought was, well, we're growing fast enough. We have to figure out how to build software outside of Los Angeles. Jud's available. Let's partner up and join forces and do that in Boulder. And so that's what we're doing. The Boulder group here is focused on, we're starting to look at how to introduce this concept of reputation in the system. We have a non-trivially sized community. We've got 12 million monthly active users, so there's real data there. And we're starting to consider the data and how we can provide a better experience for our users with it. We quite literally have done nothing with it until today. We've been kind of this one product for a long time, and we're starting to explore beyond that.
Love it. Last question.
Actually, on that, we're hiring.
Okay,
software.
30-second plug. What are you hiring for?
General caption, senior back-end infrastructure software folks. If you have microservices experience, that's awesome. Machine learning experience, that's awesome. Kind of, if you're a language generalist, then kind of whatever. I wouldn't necessarily focus on that, but not front-end related stuff.
Go check out.
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna get shot for not knowing this.
Oh, sorry. Here, we can put it in the link below on the YouTube.
Oh man, there are recruiters now looking at me.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, it's fine. Joinhoney.com/careers.
Love it. Joinhoney.com/careers. And if not, we'll fix it later. Edit, post-processing. Okay, so one last question to wrap everything up, and then we'll open up to the audience. So if you have a question that you have been dying to ask, maybe something more technical that I didn't touch on because I'm not a technical person. You have worked in tech your whole career. You've seen trends come and go. You've seen data grow like crazy. You've seen social grow like crazy. What comes next? Do you have any insight? Do you have any opinions?
Very much so.
Okay.
So I think, and what's particularly cool about this is I think we get to see it in our lifetimes. Machine learning is everything. I think we'll build some cool products by hand. We'll build some cool apps, and we'll use some cool apps and blah, blah, blah. But what machine learning opens up is beyond human comprehension. And I believe that, and in particular, its application, this part's gonna sound stupid and cliche, but I believe it. Its application in the healthcare arena is going to blow our minds. And I'll go so far as to say that I think it's going to be so significant that our representatives are going to have to legislate its use in ways that traditionally big pharma and big healthcare can block because it does not benefit them. I think that's going to come very hot and heavy, and we are going to look at and think about medicine, preventative, and dealing with stuff we've got in a completely different way. So as a field, in my mind, machine learning is kind of everything now. And then the application of it is the nut, and you can play in different fields around that. Data sets really matter. Machine learning is literally nothing without data. And so curating and getting access to the right data sets and pulling them together and maintaining them, and that's going to be very interesting. I think the engines themselves are going to evolve in interesting ways. So if you're an engine person, I think there's interesting work to do there. But at a higher level tool user, in a tool user role, we're going to have people that are not necessarily they can be data scientist type people changing the world as opposed to low-level programmers, and in deep, meaningful ways, not front-end CSS, HTML, JS type people changing the world through the next cool mobile app, but higher level analytical thinkers tweaking models that change everything, which is, so I'm, as you can tell, super hot in the ML arena.
I love it. Get geeky with it. It's the best.
If you don't know what any of that meant, I would recommend you go read up on machine learning.
There's a URL for that too. We'll bring that up later. Well, thank you so very much for your time. We're going to open questions up to the audience, but first, a big round of applause. Thank you so very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, I'm going to bring the microphone around. Who wants to start? Who's got a question? Oh, yeah.
Hi. My name is Tanzim. I'm from Bangladesh. When you guys were talking about use cases and you guys were discussing emergency use cases, that brought into my mind. Since I work as a GIS analyst, did you consider using emergency use cases like using semantic and sentiment analysis and using geospatial data as leverage to predict the spread of riots or the spread of diseases when you're working at Gnip?
Yeah, we did not do that directly. We had customers that did precisely that. And that, for all of social's problems today, there is no denying that it is evolving the people of Earth in an interesting way. And riots are an interesting consideration of that. Activism is an interesting consideration of that. Arab Spring is an interesting example of all of that. And so understanding how conversation moves around geographically is very important and interesting and crucial. We did not do that work ourselves. We did with Twitter in particular, and I don't know where this stands now, but at the time you could opt in to geocode your tweets, so the lat long was embedded in there. I don't know where that is today, but that was certainly a conversation, and at least at the time, a lot of interest in geodata.
Anyone else? Yeah, Brian. Brian's a member here at Galvanize. Just kidding. Here you go.
Hello. I'm curious, from the Gnip days to Honey, what did you learn at Gnip about company culture that maybe you changed at Honey or vice versa? I'm just kind of curious what you learned there and how you develop culture within the company.
Were there two parts there, or did it land on what did I carry from Gnip to Honey?
Yeah, I'd love to know that. Okay. Let's start there. Yeah.
Okay. Oh boy. Honey's an existing multi-hundred beast already with a culture. And so in a situation like that, a lot of it comes down to how do you map into an existing scenario. So certainly energy around that. There have been no terrible conflicts. It's more just kind of how do you make adjustments both directions to support things. Honey has been growing very quickly. I'm doing everything I can to carry the engineering first torch. There's a lot of science and a lot of technical work to be done on our infrastructure, on our products. And I believe to sustainably come at that, the thought is technical and software driven as opposed to something else. That's not to say product doesn't certainly obviously product defines things and prioritizes things, but there's a bigger part of the puzzle there, which is engineering and is the software end of it. So I've just been carrying that torch through the system and trying to work with the team here in Boulder to exemplify that and own that and champion that and carry it forward. Does that answer your question? Is that the arena?
So the question was, how do you get people amped on your vision for how to build a culture, right? Okay.
Whatever your vision is for the
Okay. It starts with the vision. It starts with an interesting problem. So you, if you don't have that, you just quite literally have nothing. Some people are able to rally interest and investment and convince others that they have something. Some people truly believe they have something. Like, I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but it just starts there, you know, at the idea, at the vision, and understanding that in various contexts and settings, and what do your peers think about the idea, and then being able to convert that into something that people that actually know how to solve it can be interested in. That becomes kind of the pitch or the convincing moment. Like, I have this idea here. I think it's interesting. Here's why I think it's interesting. And to you in particular, you know, look how you could help the cause. Look how you can help yourself. Like, you know, getting that idea, that vision in front of people. Creative, intelligent, smart people. And that's kind of your job, to identify, you know, suss them out and find them.
All right, we've got time for one more question. Anyone? All right.
So you mentioned that with Gnip, you were bringing a new concept to the market. So this is something that didn't exist before, which is fair. I think we can all obviously agree with you on that. How did you communicate that and pitch that to the consumers, so the people who wanted to access to the data with your API? And then the second part to that is, you mentioned that there were friends and foes in the marketplace. How did you differentiate Gnip?
So to the first question, that's where we had the wind at our back, and in some cases we didn't, but in general we did. And the way we illustrated that was, have you heard of this thing, social, to the company or the product manager? And they would look at you and say, oh yes, of course I have. What are you talking about? We're all about social. We're going to be all about social. And then the follow-on was, well, how are you doing that? And then dead silence 9 times out of 10. Or sometimes it was, we're working on it. Or we have special access. Sometimes they were working on it, generally rare, because social was this movement that blindsided everyone. So you as a company, you maybe had an engineering team executing on something, but social was this thing you were now having to relatively prioritize, and that's hard to do. It's hard to insert into somebody's product roadmap, hard to adjust priorities. So we would come in and say, look, you don't have to go that crazy. We're here, do some integration, and you now have the social that you were interested in. And that just ultimately resonated. You know, sometimes they'd go back, oh no, we got this, and then 6 months later, it's like, geez, actually we don't. You know, would you help us out? But we took that new thing, social, and just got in front of all of the targets that we knew were considering how to consider it, and proposed ourselves as the solution. Sometimes that happened like that. Sometimes it took us years to close one customer. We finally did. It was the first one we wanted to do, which exemplifies my point. We were both actually technically solving essentially the same thing. We were in different industries, but they looked at us and they're like, why would we do that? We already did that. And they were mostly right. And it took years for the maintenance cost of what they had built to overwhelm the price of us, and we wound up closing them. And then how did we differentiate Gnip amongst good players and bad players? Is that?
Just other existing entities in the market, because it was drawing some.
Yeah. A combination of product quality and consistency and technical capability, and then on the business side, partnerships. You know, it was through a lot of hard work and energy and negotiating partnerships that other people didn't have. And so, you know, our pitch resonated with some consumers because we had the product they want, the technical thing they wanted, and it resonated with others because we had the data that they wanted. And that data, at least 2/3 of the time, came via partnerships that we had established. So a lot of partnership energy on that front. Yeah, sure.
All right, well, we're going to close it out so you guys can get home before the roads maybe freeze. Thank you so very much, Jud, again,
Thank
for
you.
everything. Thank you guys for coming. Big round of applause. There's still chips and drinks and grab some. But
Thanks, everyone. Fun. Thanks, Kitty.
yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for coming into Galvanize. We really appreciate all of you. And good night.